Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's Guardian Australia Book Club. My name is Lucy Clark, and I'm the Features Editor of Guardian Australia, and I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land on which I'm working today, the Cammeraygal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping first before we introduce our guest. Those of you who have been here before know how these sessions work. First of all, they're interactive. You're all muted for now though, but if you turn your screen to gallery mode on the top right-hand corner and turn your cameras on, you'll get a sense of how many people we have here today. Secondly, if you open the chat box on the bottom of your screen, you can type messages to all of us, introduce yourselves here and chat to each other, recommend books, and most importantly, ask any questions you'd like our guest to answer. If we see a question that we like, we'll message you and ask you if you'd like to ask it yourself on camera. So keep an eye on your direct messages, please. It's also likely that we won't get to all of your questions. So please, let's keep them concise and on point today. Finally, we are recording for a video that will be published on the Guardian website. So please, let's keep it all nice. I'm so thrilled that today we have the award-winning author Charlotte Wood as our guest. She's taken her place in the Australian literary firmament with novels such as The Natural Way of Things and The Weekend, and her latest book belongs up there as well. The Luminous Solution is a collection of Charlotte's writings which all cohere around a central idea that a rich inner life is something valuable to aim for, something to actively nurture, and something that she believes to be the birthright of us all, not only those who make art for a living. Charlotte, welcome to Guardian Australia's Book Club.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you everyone for coming. I just want to note that normally I live in Sydney in Marrickville, but today I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Darkinjung people, which is the Brisbane water area of the Central Coast. Very beautiful place where I'm very, very lucky to be allowed to go.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to hop straight into it because I know we'll have lots of questions. Charlotte, in the preface of The Luminous Solution, you write, "The following book is a synthesis of everything I've learned about my own creative impulse since I first began trying to write fiction more than 30 years ago." And it made me really curious about that Charlotte Wood of 30 years ago. I wonder if you can just take us back in time and tell us, who is this young woman? What is she like? And why does she want to write books?
Wow. 30 years ago. I kept thinking, I've been writing for about 20 years. And then actually a lot longer. So 30 years ago, I was in my late 20s. I was a bookish child in that I read a lot. I wasn't one of those kids who wrote or whoever wanted to be a writer. I didn't know that I wanted to be a writer, but I was, very goody two-shoes at school. I loved English. It was my favorite subject. So I loved writing essays and reading and all of that. But I never knew that I would write fiction. People would say to me sometimes, "Oh, I think maybe one day you're going to write a novel," they say things to, and I was just like, how on earth would that ever happen? I had nothing to say. I had no ideas for a book or anything like that. But I was a mature age student when I went to university when I was 23, which I felt was ancient at the time compared to all the 18-year-olds that I started with. And I did start doing creative writing classes at university with a wonderful teacher called Joan Phillip. But I sort of dabbled, I wrote a couple of little things that were published, really probably shouldn't have been published, just little fragments really. And I was probably like a lot of people when they think I'd like to write, I thought one day I'll get around to that. One day when I have time, when I have more confidence, when I, have some money, I will, put some more energy into it. And then, of course, I didn't do any of those things. Then when I was 29, my mum died and my father had died when I was 19. And I think that sort of event, and lots of people watching will know this feeling, that when a real crisis hits you, you can see things suddenly very clearly in terms of what matters, what doesn't matter. You know, you can look around your life and think that doesn't matter anymore. That does. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly knew that writing really mattered to me. It mattered immensely. And so I decided to commit, basically. That was all I decided to do. Commit to learning, to trying to finish something, whether it was a story or a poem or whatever. And just sort of arrange my life to put writing, not necessarily right at the center, but certainly give it space. You know, gave up other things in order to commit to that.
There's a lot of discipline involved in that idea to commit. And in your book, you do go quite a lot into the notions of inspiration and discipline and the muse and rational thinking. Can you tell us a bit about how you've balanced those what seem to be opposing forces, but perhaps are not, in the process of becoming a writer?
Yeah, I think those two forms of thinking are really crucial to any sort of creativity, really. And when I'm talking about creativity, I mean, it's a kind of a word that, you know, it's a bit nauseating sometimes. Oh, creativity. But I can't really think of another word for it, but making anything, whether it's making a garden or making a meal or a ceramic pot or whatever, it's the paying of attention and the devotion of energy and time and space to learning your craft or your skill. And so a lot of that, especially in the learning phase, that sort of discipline and rational thinking and pragmatism and just showing up and putting the kind of boundaries of time and space in. So saying, no, I can't go out for lunch because I'm writing, which is a hard thing to do when you haven't published anything or you haven't. I mean, I advise new writers when they say, oh, but I don't know how to say that. And I say, well, don't tell them that. Just tell them you've got a meeting, you're seeing your mother, whatever, just lie. Figure out a way, though, to create the boundaries, because you cannot work consistently if you don't put those boundaries in place. But so and there's also, you know, the rational thinking that's required to shape a narrative in writing's case, to you know, to work out there's a logical flow of information, all that sort of stuff. So that in the sort of creativity literature is called convergent thinking, where you're sort of narrowing things down. But the other form of thinking is divergent thinking, which is the loose, associative, intuitive, dreamy, access to the unconscious sort of thinking, where you must allow things that don't make sense to sort of take hold and to interest you and follow them. And it's sort of, in a way, I think my first novel was written very much out of that dreamy space. And then I sort of became somehow ashamed of that went off to be really as sort of, you know, proper and rational as I could be. And only really with the natural way of things did it all just come flying back, because there was no other way to write that book.
I want to get to that in a minute, but I just want to pause there and ask you about that first experience of writing and the way it came from that dreamy state. Was that, do you think, because of a lack of any sort of pressure or commercial pressure?
Yeah, just oblivion and a lack of knowledge, knowledge of how to write a story, you know. Yes. And it was sort of almost, and I feel sort of glad in a way that it came from that. And it was a very weird book that there's no way it would be published now. For a start, it was tiny, it was 35,000 words, you know, and it was weird. And it was, you know, it sold a few copies and then got pulped. So it was an inauspicious beginning.
Right.
But that was good for me, I think.
It might be the equivalent that a lot of people talk about having their first manuscript in the bottom drawer that was never published.
Yeah. Well, this was published, but possibly shouldn't have been. I mean, I feel warmly towards it, as you would towards a sort of awkward teenage niece or something. But I was glad to get past that.
So you do say in your book that it is the natural way of things that has taught you the most about your creativity, which you just mentioned. Why is that the one that did it?
I think because I finally let all the unconscious stuff really come sort of streaming up. So I was writing The Natural Way of Things. It wasn't working. It was dead on the page. And I was trying to apply too much rationality to this story. So for those who don't know anything about that book, it's most commonly described as a feminist dystopia about misogyny. And it was a kind of surreal, weird book, very dark. And I was trying to sort of just use my rational mind to make that book, which meant only sticking with the really bleak nature of the material. And it wasn't until I let all the kind of quite primitive, symbolic, surreal, dreamy, ghostly kind of things in that it started to come alive. And it really happened just by out of sheer desperation, because I just tried all kinds of things to make it work. And to me, the dreamy, the imagistic, strange, ghostly things in that book lightened the darkness of the material. I don't know if other people feel like that, but it sort of gave this altered sense of reality that I hope it makes that story more bearable than, just a realist kind of description of horrible things.
It seems like in the way you're talking there that there's a sort of you give the control away, like from yourself to the work. Yeah. And I was interested to hear you say in another interview about this book, The Luminous Solution, that you often go to the desk with, I wonder what I'm going to find out today, what might be revealed. Whereas I think a lot of people think writers go to the desk and say, well, today I'm going to do this, 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 and achieve this. And they have this, perfectionist idea of what the outcome is going to be. How have you always sort of been able to sort of let go like that into the work?
No, and that was another thing The Natural Way of Things taught me. That sort of pragmatist, rational, disciplined, routine-driven perfectionism is really, really not useful, but the kind of, the person who doesn't miss deadlines and who turns up and is a sort of a good girl, that's actually a very useful sort of personality trait to have, as long as, for me, only once I start to let go the reins a bit does the really good gold stuff come, that I find interesting. And I kind of learned that while I was writing The Natural Way of Things, partly from a bunch of interviews that I did with other Australian writers. I was putting together a book called The Writer's Room, which is interviews with lots of Australian writers. And one of those was Joan London, whose writing I adore. And she talked about sort of allowing the work to come to you and allowing the gifts of the unconscious to arrive. And that was just sort of so revolutionary to me, even though, of course, I'd heard that sort of talk before, but maybe it wasn't, maybe it was just finally I needed to do that. And then it just sort of takes the performance anxiety, I guess, out of writing. And I went to a really bad place while I was writing that book. It was very tough material to work with. It wasn't working. I was miserable. It was at that point, which lots of artists and writers and everyone gets to, of thinking, why am I doing this? There's no pleasure in this for me. It's just, it turned out that book, did very well, but up until then, my books had been, sort of critically well received, sold a few, not so. It's that thing, you're always struggling financially. You're thinking, who's going to read this? Who's going to want to read this book particularly? But once I allowed those sort of primitive, unconscious, symbolic, dreamy, ghostly things in, I became interested in it again, you know, and it gave me something to go, oh, I wonder. And, you know, and I came across this study that I talk about in the Luminous Solution that did really help me as well. And that was the meta-analysis of 25 years of mood and creativity research. And this, I read this study, this meta-analysis, and it basically said, it was a cognitive psychology thing. And it basically said that the way I went to the desk was the opposite of what had been found over 25 years to be the most creative mood state. So I would go with, you know, fear, anxiety, gloominess, certainty that it was going to be disaster, couldn't wait to get it over with. You know, basically just a pretty miserable approach. And this analysis said there were three main components to the most creative mood state, and they were a slightly elevated activation, it was a slightly energized, which I sort of took to mean slightly excited, sort of anticipatory feeling, a positive hedonic tone, just a positive, you know, up rather than down feeling. And the third one was what they called a promotion focus. And that meant seeking gain rather than avoiding pain. So I was the opposite, and the opposite of those things was the least creative mood state. So what I sort of translated in shorthand for myself out of that study was that the most creative mood is a slightly excited, curious optimism. And that I sort of learned how to sort of decide that that was going to be my mood before I start working. Now, it sounds kind of bonkers, and it also sounds like, well, you're just faking it then. And I, you know, when I talk to new or other artists about it, and I said, yeah, I did fake it. I faked it, and then it worked. So then I felt that, you know. So that sense of thinking, going to the work thinking, I wonder what's going to happen here, rather than, oh, here I go, it's going to be terrible, you know. And for me, that sense of discovery brings energy. You know, there's a sort of risk involved because I don't know what's going to happen. And so it's like I'm finding out along with the reader, you know, and then of course I go and shape it and whatever. But I do think there's an energy that comes from not knowing.
Yeah.
And you know, all through the Luminous Solution, I talk about the state of the artist, in my opinion, being this state of unknowing and uncertainty, and always living between certainties and sort of groping towards certainty, but never actually finding it. And I think that's a really energetic space to work in.
There's something else there as well, and you mentioned this about writing the natural way of things, the difficulty of it, and actually moving towards the difficulty and the pain and looking for trouble, which you write about a lot. It becomes the point in a way, doesn't it? Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, it's good to think about what that word difficulty means, because it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, darkness in the work or coming from a place of pain or trauma or anything. But difficulty could be a formal difficulty for a writer. You know, it could be I want to write a book set in 3 time frames, and you know, so there's a kind of technical difficulty there. It could be the material itself, the story is difficult, but it's the kind of striving. I mean, it's this weird combination between not striving and striving, and that again is this sort of tension that gives it energy, I think. But Philip Roth said, it was his words, looking for trouble, and he said, especially in the beginning of a work, if it's too fluent, I know there's something wrong, you know. And he said, what I'm doing in the beginning is looking for trouble. I'm looking for areas that are resisting me. I'm looking for sort of, he didn't say this space of unknowing, but that's, you know, lots of other people talk about that. And I think that's right. There's a sense of, if you know straight away what you're doing, how it's all going to pan out, then for me, the energy just completely And it's also like, well, why would I do it then? I need something to discover and to take the risk that it's not going to work, because then it's exciting, for you.
You mentioned before the Writers' Room, which is your book of interviews with lots of different authors, and you do open the Luminous Solution by saying you've always been fascinated by other people's creative lives. A lot of writers kind of studiously and deliberately are oblivious to the work of others because they're trying to keep their own work pure or whatever, I don't know. But you have this openness and this curiosity. I'm interested to know what you're looking for when you delve into the creative lives of others.
How to do it. Tell me how it works. I don't know. Sometimes I think it's a bit sort of fetishizing of, the creative state, but I don't really care if that's the case. I just find it fascinating that it's I guess particularly this tension between the pragmatist and the dreamer, those I do think the artists that I most respect do have a real acceptance of the unconscious, the dreamy space, sometimes the kind of animal self. There's a piece in the book called The Outside Voice in Praise of Unruly Artists, and I look at sort of several visual artists as well as writers like Alexis Wright and the dancer Sylvie Guillaume, who this sort of defiance and wildness in those people I find so inspiring, So I'll often go to books of interviews or things that other writers and increasingly other artists from other art forms, because it sort of often just sheds a new light on what I'm trying to do, or it phrases something in a different way that makes you go, oh. So it's often stuff that you've read before. But it's one of the things about writing is that you have to learn it all the time, how to do it. Like, I never know how to do it. It's very frustrating. But, writers say this all the time, that, every new book puts you back into that space of complete beginner status. You don't know how to, you sort of think, when I wrote my first book, I thought, oh, thank God, I've done that. So now I'll be all right with the next book. And then, of course, you sit down and you think, oh, I don't know how to do this. I have no idea. And still like that.
You mentioned before looking at like a dancer artworks, and also in your book you write a lot about other types of creativity and how they inspire and inform you. There's a chapter which starts with you writing about artwork that you really dislike, and it's confronting for you. And there's been a lot of discussion that's been growing over years about relatability and, not liking characters, and therefore I don't want to read the book. Can you talk a bit about that sort of, confronting the ideas of, not liking something and moving through it?
Yeah, that piece starts with, I was sort of playing gallery assistant for a group show organised by some friends, and I just had to sit in this room for a weekend with all these pictures that I didn't really like much. I found them kind of dark and a bit. Some of them seemed quite violent, and not the what they were depicting, but just the kind of vibe of the pictures themselves, the colours and the textures and all that. But they were chosen by an artist who I really admired. So because I was there for these 2 days pretty much by myself, I had time to think, well, what's going on when a work of art makes you feel bad? Because I had created the natural way of things that I know made quite a lot of people feel bad. And so I sort of just used that being with the paintings to really examine my own feelings about what happened in my emotions, basically. And the first thing was that I felt a bit stupid because other people thought these pictures were really good. So it must be something to do with me that I couldn't see what they saw. then that made me feel a bit sort of angry. Like it was a terrible, shameful thing to realize that I was sort of angry at being left out of the club, or, you know. Anyway, and then I went on to talk about in that piece about, it's called Reading Isn't Shopping. And to talk about when we read books that don't please us, what is, you know, is that a bad thing? What does it say about us as a reader? What's the motivation of the writer when you read something that you don't like? But also basically that chapter is a call to just get past this thing of liking and not liking, you know. And we are increasingly trained by the market to judge everything in terms of whether we like, you know, like it, don't like, you know, don't like. And it's so
5 stars,
limited.
4 stars.
Yeah, and the star rating.
Yeah.
And it's such a narrow way of looking at work. And I was reminded of my high school English teacher, Gilly Litchfield, who was an amazing teacher in my little country high school. She might even be here. Hello, Gilly. I owe you an email. I know I will respond. But she, you know, we would say, oh, I like this because I can relate to the character. And she would say, I don't care. Like, you're relating or not, or liking or not, isn't interesting to me. We're talking about what the work is doing, what the effect it has on you, what the language is doing, what the author is trying to say, the world that it's in, the context. So like way more complex picture of how to look at a book than I liked it, I didn't like it, you know. And I think we've sort of, because, you know, publishing is about selling books, and, you know, of course we writers want to sell books, we want readers. So we don't resist this thing of, you know, star ratings and all that sort of stuff. But I talk about in that chapter, getting to the end of Olive Kittredge, a book that I just have admired, and I really liked it.
5 stars.
Found so 5 stars. But straight after the final page of the book, there's a questionnaire from the publisher. Do you like Olive Kittredge as a person? Do you know anyone like Olive Kittredge? So it's all about the reader sort of giving feedback before the, you know, just read the last words, and before you've even sort of started to, you know, integrate what you've read. There's a kind of rating system presented for you. And the first one is, do you like her as a person? And of course, Olive Kittredge, for anyone who's read this marvelous work, is not a likable person.
No.
You know, she's rude, she's kind of depressed, she's really smart, she's very generous, she's all of these things. So the question of likability is just sort of really, it's just narrow. It doesn't, and also when people say, oh, that character's not likable, I always think, well, doesn't it depend what you like? You know, I like people who are a bit spiky and forthright, and, you know, don't sort of want to please you immediately. So, and I loved, actually, I included a piece that I wrote about Georgia Blaine, my friend and friend to many, many people, the writer. And she was always in trouble for not having likable women, particularly. And she laughed a lot about that, because she said, but they're just like me. So what does that tells me?
What does that say about
what people
me?
think of me.
Yeah.
So.
You mentioned before about publicity and marketing. I wonder, do you ever wish you could just write a book and just, that's it, I'm not doing any publicity, I'm not doing any of this stuff where you have to talk about it, I just want to leave it for the readers and see what happens?
I don't feel like that. I know some writers really do. I mean, maybe because I've been doing it for a long time, I don't find it as stressful as some people do. Like, really, I mean, some things are really scary, but it depends how long it goes on for. Like, with the natural way of things, like, I'm still asked to talk about that book, and that was published 6 years ago. And so I sort of make a point. I go, I will do everything for, you know, 6 months or whatever, and then I'll be more selective. And after a year or something, I'll say, no, I'm going to go and work now. And I think it's important to go back to the private space in order to work. But I don't I don't find it horrible or anything.
I just want to remind everyone to please ask some questions and we'll get some to Charlotte. I'd like to move on, Charlotte, to this idea of a rich inner life. In the essay, Fertile Ground, you paint a picture of it being the third weekend of the first lockdown. The world is in terror. Your spirit is in need of repair. And you start thinking about this thing, the inner life, and it's central to the idea of your book. So what is it and what are the circumstances by which we can all get one?
Yeah, that was one of those commissions. I was commissioned to write something about the inner life, and I was one of those times where I wouldn't have probably come up with that notion myself, but once I started to think about it, it became very interesting to me, and particularly because the timing turned out to be, the beginning of that piece is, so it's the third weekend of the first lockdown. Little did I know that a year later, 18 months later, here we would still be. And I was in a kind of utter panic, just panic about what was going to happen. I think a lot of us were at that point. We didn't know if people we loved were going to die, if we might die, if our livelihoods were going to vanish. My husband has a business that employs like 6 people who've all got families, and was that all going to end? So it was all very stressful. But I realized fairly quickly that the manifestation of my panic was to rush around filling up my sort of private space and self with external things that are kind of all very worthwhile, like books and yoga classes and cooking, and not sourdough bread. I didn't get quite that far, but but I realized fairly quickly that I was being just as rampantly acquisitive with this kind of stuff as if, eating McDonald's. It was the same sort of impulse of just cram things in to kind of somehow try to quell this panic. And of course, it wasn't working. And only when I just thought, I've just got to stop this sort of constant movement and noise and motion. And panic, that I started to think about this thing called the inner life and what is it, and I suppose I think an inner life that is alive depends on you having a sense of its value, that your mind is a thing of value and needs to be protected and nourished, and not just be prey to every random thing that comes into your mind, that you can keep certain things out of it and put certain things into it. And then I realized immediately that the inner life for an artist is always tied up with their work. It's always sort of, one thing. And the inner life of a novelist is quite often this imaginative world that is nourished by the outside world, but is sort of separate from it. And so I kind of then wanted to examine, well, what are the things that that nourish a rich inner life, and what are the things that deplete your sense of enjoyment of it? And the nourishing things were often things from the outside world, like physical things, just boring things like eating properly and sleeping, and for me, going to bed early and getting up really early, having some sense of order in my physical surroundings, having, the pavers swept in the tiny little courtyard that we have, this sense of kind of outer order, but also not filling up my time and my brain with too much stuff. So having that, like I keep saying, these boundaries, so making sure I'm not doing too much socializing or too much watching of TV or whatever.
Is that your weak point? What are you at risk of putting into your brain that would sully the purity?
So pure in there. For me, probably like a lot of socializing, which I love, and I would love to see my friends every day, but it does, especially as I get older, it takes more energy away from, like, it's almost like you have to go to this point of stillness, I suppose. And that's what that chapter is about a lot, is how we kind of, the inner life depends on the ability to go empty, to not fill it up with anything. But also when we get that stillness, it can be frightening, because we're kind of, the whole of contemporary life is designed to kill any inner stillness, because we need to, fill it up with noise and motion and buy stuff. So for me, a lot of socializing means I'm just sort of, whirring away and a bit hyper excited, overstimulated. So that sort of quietness is good for my work, if I can just chill out a bit.
I have a question from Alicia, and she's asked me to ask for you. Hi, Charlotte. I'm fascinated by the ending of The Natural Way of Things, where the main character gets off the bus. Is that something we have to do sometimes? I think there is this idea of the world to heal, but also in the submerged cathedral. Sorry, I'm trying to work out the meaning of this sentence. Of retreating from the world, that is joining a monastery. Can you talk to that a bit?
I can. Thank you, Alicia, for that question. It's interesting you say that, because the book that I'm working on now is about an enclosed order of nuns. So the ending of The Natural Way of Things, I won't go into the actual ending in case people want to read it, but it's a kind of a split ending, and I've found that how people feel about the ending of the book depends on which party they kind of follow at the end, and whether they're kind of thoroughly traumatized and disillusioned, or full of hope and sort of courage. But getting off the bus, I love that some reading groups, when I was talking about that book a lot, they said, oh, it's become a kind of little mantra, you've got to get off the bus. And I do think stepping away from the mainstream is really important, certainly important for any artist or any creative person who wants creativity in their life, to be able to step away from not just the noise and the the distractions of mainstream life, but the mainstream thinking. You have to be brave enough to have your own thoughts. And that's why this stillness and quiet and getting away from filling up your mind with the opinions and everything of other people can also, you need to get away from that in order to, I can only speak for myself. I need to get away from that in order to come up with anything new for myself. But I do think, I think the pandemic has shown us, the lockdowns have shown us things about ways to live that we may not have considered. A friend of mine said this morning, I hate lockdown improvement stories, but then, came up with something that she had found sort of improving through being in lockdown. And I think a lot of people are discovering that they quite like a much quieter life, that they quite like not being out all the time.
What about you personally?
Yeah, I mean, as long as I don't, I've found the separation from people really, really hard, especially some dear friends of mine have been going through really quite hellish health things and whatever, unrelated to COVID, and had to do it alone. And I hated not being able to go and hug somebody or drive them to the hospital or whatever. But otherwise, we had some beautiful times alone, my husband and I, doing jigsaws. I actually really like it. It's a very meditative space that we would get into on a weekend. I would cook, long, slow cooking stuff. We'd just have music and do jigsaws. We didn't actually get into a lot of television like lots of people do.
What about creatively? Because it would seem to be that isolation is the perfect mise en scene for a writer, but there were certainly other forces at play in the world that might detract from the idea of creativity.
Yeah. Well, at the beginning, I sort of felt like, well, this should be good for me, and it wasn't, because of the anxiety, So the thing I said at the beginning about anxiety being one of the least creative mood states, the anxiety in the air, especially once the Delta strain came in. I felt like every time we stepped outside our house in Sydney, there was just like a wall of fear. And I was, not immune to that at all. So I didn't find it a deeply creative time, but it did allow me to put the Luminous Solution together, because it was a way to go into thinking about things carefully, but sort of revisiting stuff that I'd written before. Quite often, the pieces in the book are complete rewrites of things that I had written before. Like some of them are, sort of decades old. And I thought, I remember that thing I wrote about dreams. And I'd pull it up and think, actually, I don't think that anymore. But there might be 3 paragraphs that I then kept and then wrote new material around. So it was a good time to write some shorter pieces that then hopefully go into a cohesive whole.
And you said in your preface, you wrote in your preface, you had resisted pulling together this sort of book in the past. So why is the time right for this one and this theme?
Because it was this theme, probably. In the past, I'd sort of, a couple of people say, well, you've written all these different, like I've written lots of pieces about all kinds of things, quite a lot for you, as we know. So thank you very much. But, there are some pieces that I've written for you that I would not put in this book because they weren't about the creative impulse, I suppose. And I am just increasingly interested in how I wanted to make a book that was whole, that was a book of sort of chapters rather than separate things just brought together. So I hope that, and there were lots of things, like I had lots of profiles of other artists that I really liked, because I love talking to other artists, but we decided not to put them in the book because they were more sort of journalistic, I guess, and they were about watching someone else rather than interrogating my own process.
Kate has posed a question, but she hasn't answered about whether she's happy to go on camera or not. I just thought I might ask her and put her on the spot. Kate, your question about the mystics. Are you there? And do you want to ask it on camera? If not, I'll go right ahead. Okay, so the mystics of the Catholic spiritual tradition and most other traditions point to the silence of the nada space of contemplative stillness. How important is it to be able to bear this silence?
Good question, Kate. As an ex-Catholic myself, I should know more about the Catholic mystics, but I know nothing. Yeah, I think it is, contemplative is the word. You have to be able to bear silence and stillness. I think to be an artist, you have to not only be able to bear it, but actually enjoy it. It's where you get your stuff from. But it can be lonely and it can be frightening sometimes. But I think somewhere in the book I say that the stillness is not a void, it's a well. It fills, if you let it be, if you let your mind be still, it will fill with interesting things of its own accord. Things for me, from that unconscious mind that then show me what my preoccupations are and what I'm interested in, and where I might go from there. But if I'm constantly looking for stuff to put into my mind, it doesn't work as well for me. So, but I'm also always resisting it. I don't like being still. I'm quite a restless person. I've got a really short attention span. I'm just sort of, like, I just want to, come on, let's go, let's do it. So it's quite a big practice for me to constantly remind myself of going, oh, that's right, I have to go very quiet. And it takes practice. It really takes practice, I think, for anybody, especially now, especially with social media, and where at any time at your fingertips you can be chatting to anybody.
The stillness doesn't have to be physical, though, does it? Because you mentioned in the book, maybe writers love walking so much. It's because, you have got this antsiness that you just want to get going, but you can actually have mental stillness while you're putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, and that's a kind of convenient way of getting past that terror of the stillness. It's just, some kind of methodical, easy sort of physical movement. Lots of people like swimming or gardening. I mean, I really like gardening for that reason too, where you have something to occupy you consciously, but it's not like a demanding, learning something new. That wouldn't allow the unconscious to send up all the good stuff. But something like walking, swimming, maybe kayaking, I don't know, something that sort of tricks your mind into paying attention to, in a loose kind of way, to your surroundings, but it does allow all the other stuff to rise up.
We were talking before about Catholicism and the fact that you didn't really learn much, as you say, but you did receive a gift from childhood of Catholicism, didn't you? Boredom.
Are we talking about boredom? Yes.
Yeah.
I always think I do. So there's a piece in the book. There was an essay for Lucy in The Guardian, kind of about what Catholicism gave me. And I think I say the first and most obvious gift was boredom. Because as a child, I went to Mass with my family every week, from birth to when I left home. And it was this enforced quiet, sort of absorbing by osmosis what was going on in the words of the priest, which often were words that basically told me girls didn't exist and were worth nothing. But a lot of it was just, as a small child, just sitting virtually on the floor. I do talk about biting the pew, and I remember the taste of the pew when you're like a toddler and you just put everything in your mouth. And I tell you what, after I published that with you, so many people said to me, I remember that.
I know that taste.
It was so weird. So many people. So I'm sure there's a lot of pew biters out there today. But just being forced into amusing myself for an hour a week. So when you're 5 years old, having to sit still and be quiet for an hour is a really, quite a challenge. But I found it very beautiful. It sort of gave me and my siblings, I think, a kind of privacy and a feeling of dreaminess that you could just sit there and virtually go to sleep or think whatever you wanted to think and look at all these people and decide what you thought about them. And, no one was really watching you, except you had to just keep still, and then you got in trouble if you weren't. But I think that's really good for children, to be forced to be bored. And I think we're so obsessed with amusing kids now that we don't ever let them get bored.
I wonder if something else happened there too. I interviewed the author Alexander McCall Smith once, who said that church as a child gave him his sense of rhythm, because the words of the King James Bible were so rhythmic, and he believed that gave him this sense of musicality when he would hear his sentences aloud in his head.
I think that's really absolutely true for me as well. And also the imagery of the Bible was so wild and sort of, all the kind of supernatural weirdo things that I loved. I was very into, the burning bush and the loaves and the fishes and the miracles and all the kind of, stuff that is basically magical. And I think that was really gave me a sense of access to this otherworldly state that is and the kind of potency of objects. I was talking about this with Helen Garner in the event I did with her recently, where, you know, the Bible is full of objects that have this sort of amazing power, you know, and now I won't be able to think of any, but things like loaves and fishes, you know, a loaf of bread and a fish has this huge sort of resonance because of that story. But also lots of gold, and, you know, there's a sort of whole spectacle of stuff, not only in the Bible, but in the Catholic Church, that also was very appealing. And there's a bit in that chapter where I talk about, once I went to some sort of Protestant Sunday school with some other kid. I don't know how I even met a non-Catholic child, but, and it was just, I was so appalled because we just went in this room that didn't have any statues or gold or candles or stained glass. It was just like a random meeting room. And we were given like a biscuit and told some little story. And it was sort of like, how the hell is this anything like church? This was just like going to the bank or something. It was really not, and then you none of the kind of oogie boogie spectacle that I was keen on.
And then you had to sing Kumbaya.
Yeah, probably. Mind you, our hymns were very, very bad in the Catholic Church.
I'd like to talk a bit about language. We just were talking before about rhythm and musicality, because, you know, surely the love of words and sentences which lay the foundation for anyone who loves to write. But we've kind of moved away from discussing these very building blocks a bit, haven't we? And we're just always talking about plot and backstory and the characters. So talk to us a bit about the love of language.
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book called The Paint Itself. And, you know, I sort of refer to painting particularly a lot in the book. And I came across an interview with an American painter called Laurie Fendrick. And she said, ever since the invention of painting on canvas, the paint itself has been part of the meaning of a painting. And I just found this really compelling, even though I didn't quite fully understand what it meant. But then I was thinking about, you know, well, for writers, you know, words are obviously paint, our paint. And it is true that when we talk about, when I write a novel and I go and talk about it in the world, we never talk about language. We talk about the story, the people in the story, the themes of the story, and very quickly we even move quite away from the book itself. So in The Weekend, which is a book about three women friends in their 70s, very quickly the conversation would turn to aging and our culture's attitudes toward aging. Or with, you know, The Natural Way of Things, obviously it was very quickly we were talking about Harvey Weinstein or, you know, just misogyny in general. And that's good because it means that the book speaks to, you know, things outside the book itself. But it's also kind of, I find it a little sad that we don't linger a bit more on the thing that makes the book, which is the language. And that particular chapter is about sentences and what makes a good sentence. And my friend, the writer Tegan Bennett Daylight, and I gave a workshop called, I think it was called What Makes a Good Sentence. And we had to figure it out for ourselves. Like, well, what are the qualities of a good sentence? And we came up with 5 aspects, I think, which were, I'm never going to remember them all: authority, clarity, energy, musicality, and flair. So of course flair is, you know, the X factor one.
Yeah.
But I also say in that, so then it sort of goes through what each of those things might be in any given sentence. And I, you know, I recognize that on another day we might have come up with 5 other, you know, essential qualities of a good sentence. But it was so fun to just think about a sentence and what it does, which, you know, it's weird that we don't.
Who springs to mind when you think about who writes perfect sentences?
Well, any good writer, really. I mean, I guess when I think about a good sentence, I'm not thinking about a beautiful sentence necessarily, you know, I'm thinking about an effective sentence doing what it's setting out to do within the context. So I I don't know, the ones that we were looking at in that workshop were people like Toni Morrison. I think I had Alexis Wright in there. Very different, you know, completely different sides of language, but also very plain sentences. We talked about Catherine Mansfield, you know, I think Tegan was talking about Gerald Durrell. So I don't have any idea of, you know, a particular kind of sentence, but it's just looking at, you know, back to my wonderful English teachers. That's what we would do, is look at the words and go, what's happening in this sentence? What's happening with the rhythm and the length of it and the syntax and the paragraphs? And, you know, it's so rich when you actually just focus down and look at it.
Lovely. So we are running a little bit out of time, and well, a lot out of time. So I just want to come to my final question, Charlotte. We started this conversation talking about the 20-something Charlotte. Given all you've learned over these 3 decades, what would be the best bit of advice you would give her? Sorry, that's a terrible question.
No,
hard question.
I think it's hard, isn't it? Because the person that you are now comes out of that person who was such a wreck in so many ways. But probably just be less afraid of everything. Just relax. I think the anxiety of the young, certainly of my young self, was very hard to live with. But I think be brave enough to actually just say what you think. And I guess I always thought, I don't think anything. I have no, you know, I'm too afraid of expressing what I think because it'll be wrong or it'll be stupid or someone will laugh at it or whatever. And now I think the thing that I've discovered is that if you acknowledge really your own uncertainties and questions and whatever, that's when you start having good conversations, you know, on the page or with people. It's very banal to say that. Just be yourself. It's my mother always used to say.
But how does that tally with the power surge you write about when you turn 50?
That's funny. I mean, so I did the day I turned 50, I was expecting that I would feel, you know, some terrible calamity befalling me. And it was a very strange feeling. I've never had it since, but it was just this sense of energy and clarity and authority and power. It was weird. It was great. It didn't last very long in that form, but it certainly, I just feel so much better being older than, I think being young is really hard. I think it's harder now than it was when I was young. So just having a bit of a sort of decision to have confidence is really liberating, you know. And I think every artist has to absolutely learn that. You don't wait, you know, you don't wait to do your work until you have some confidence. You decide you're going to have the confidence to do it, and just do it. And don't waste time, you know, life is short, man.
We did talk about faking it till you make it. I hate to end on a cliche, but it's a good one. So we have run out of time. Thank you everyone so much, and mostly thank you to Charlotte. If you love literature, and I assume because you're in our book club, you do, then I really recommend The Luminous Solution. It's a wonderful brain cleansing book that will immerse you in the deliciousness of language, and the very paint of it is lovely. So please everyone, go and get it. Don't write your resignations and become a writer just yet. Read that first. That's what I wanted to do.
Thank you, Lucy, and thanks so much everyone for coming. It was really lovely to talk with you.
It's been a pleasure. So thanks again. Goodbye everyone. See you next time.